Now we are recording. Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to deliver this paper. This is after the conference, but I'm going to read the paper as I read it at the conference. Monophonic Credos and their cultural background in the late medieval period. Most of the people attending this conference do not need to be reminded about the explosion of new credos, mostly propagated in canto fratto style between 1300 and 1500. The earliest melody for the creed probably became the melody known in the Liber Usualis as Credo I, first appearing in manuscripts in the 10th century. For 4 to 5 centuries until about 1300, the Credo I melody was the only melody for a credo sung at Mass, with a few exceptions. Other early credo melodies are preserved in the Vatican edition, specifically credos 2, 5, and 6, but those melodies are merely regional variants of Credo I. Beginning around 1300, primarily in southern France and northern Italy, the number of compositions of new melodies for the credo grew rapidly. In his catalog of monophonic credos, published in 1976, Tadeusz Miazga documents 57 new melodies. Later catalogs, articles, and archival discoveries have revealed more, pushing the number closer to 70. So here's just a comparison. On the left side is credos before 1300. On the right side, and this is just using Miazga's catalog, is the number of credos that he highlights in manuscripts between 1300 and 1500. To put the paucity of credos before 1300 in perspective, note that the Liber Usualis preserves 27 Kyries composed between the 10th and 13th centuries, many coming from troped chants, 16 Glorias, 18 Sanctus, 14 Agnus Deis, and 1 Credo. Scholars have not been able to answer why so many new credo melodies developed after 1300. Richard Scher writes that it is a, quote, phenomenon that has been noted but little studied. It is not clear why, after approximately 500 years, there was this need to have new musical settings to replace the standard Credo I, end quote. Along with the proliferation of new credo compositions, there was a growth in popular devotion to and knowledge of the creed. 2 citations of medieval authors illustrate this change. Sicardo of Cremona wrote his Mitrale in the 1180s and 90s as a liturgical commentary for his diocese. In his elaboration on the third part of the Mass, he writes, with the creed having been sung before and while it is sung, in some places the people chant Kyrie eleison, because after Christ and the apostles taught the people, after the faith was received, they gave praises to God. Sicardo witnesses to a regional practice of the creed being sung by the clergy, and followed by a Kyrie eleison sung by the lay people. The assumption here is that the lay people could not sing the credo along with the clergy, and opted for the shorter endorsement of the credo's contents by singing Kyrie eleison. In contrast, Giuseppina de Sandra Gasparini brings attention to a legal document from 15th century Veneto, detailing the complaints of church authorities against a lay confraternity using a diocesan church. Among their complaints, the church authorities write, further, he celebrates when he also wants in cantu, and the confraternity members, mind you, who are craftsmen and mere laymen, sing with him and celebrate and attend to the holy things, namely by setting up the missal and the pax, by lighting candles and offering incense and in offering water for the purification of the priest, and preparing the altars, and helping to say, and the verb there is dicere, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, etc., Spiritu tuo sanctus sanctus, credo in Deum Patrem, the epistles, Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi. In this 15th century document, the mere laymen are even assisting the priest in his chanting or recitation of the creed. Although these 2 texts are written for different occasions in different times and places, they hint at the involvement of some laity in the Mass. The congregation of Sicardo's time sings the Kyrie as a substitute for the creed, whereas the confraternity members of the 15th century legal dispute know the creed well enough to sing it with the clergy. Something happened between these 2 writings, which changed how the people knew and learned the creed. I argue that understanding the cultural religious background of the Credo in the time period between 1100 and 1500 helps to explain the proliferation of new Credo melody compositions. While musical changes are also important for understanding the new Credo melodies, in this paper, I intend to link a religious cultural understanding of the position of the Credo to the musical phenomenon. Specifically, that religious cultural understanding is multidimensional. The multidimensional status of the Credo as an object of catechism, devotion, and liturgy was unusual, if not unique, during the period of 1300 to 1500. This situation may explain the multiplication of new Credo melodies during this period. Unfortunately, as with most aspects of medieval studies, there is no smoking gun from a composer somewhere in Italy describing why he wrote a new Credo melody. My aim in this paper, building on research from my dissertation, is to convey the cultural import of the Credo had in late medieval culture. Catechism, devotion, and liturgy are three essential aspects of late medieval religious culture. Perhaps we can say that almost every feature of medieval religious life emerges from these categories. Catechism is the teaching and learning of the faith and includes the impulse to learn Catholic doctrine integrally. Devotion includes all popular forms of religious expression, from pilgrimage to the rosary to paraliturgical devotional songs. Liturgy comprises the ritual life of the Catholic Church, felt particularly in its cyclical calendar. Every day, week, and year followed a similar cycle of feasts, fasts, and commemorations. The Credo is unique in that it straddles all three of these aspects. It is at once an object, or the object, of catechism, as well as the primary means of catechism. That is, learning the Credo became the means by which Catholic faithful learned the teachings of the Church. Perhaps because of this exalted catechetical status, it quickly assumed a position as an object of devotion. This is readily apparent in artwork depicting the Credo in the high medieval period, from around 1200. As a liturgical component, the Credo was established in the office and baptism liturgies in the first millennium, and in the Mass in the 11th century. Yet it assumed an expanded role in the wake of renewed emphases in the 12th century from catechesis and devotion, flowering into an object of art, music, and liturgical order. So I'll explore each of these categories one by one. First, we'll explore catechesis. Proper catechesis was a concern of Christian writers and thinkers from the earliest days of Christianity, evident in the epistles of the New Testament. Yet in the 12th century church, a distinct change occurred in the expectations of clergy and laity concerning their knowledge of the rudiments of the faith. Scholars point to a 12th century renaissance among intellectuals of the church, a renaissance particularly of theology and canon law, but also of the discovery of the individual, according to some historians. Several of the theological writers of the 12th century, particularly Peter Abelard, Hugh of St. Victor, Richard of St. Victor, and Peter Lombard, emphasized an intellectual ownership of faith in addition to an obedient submission to the beliefs of the church. Certainly, the budding scholastic movement was not afraid to ask serious questions of theology and ethics, but the overall spirit was still combined with one of submission to the doctrines of the church. Andrew Reeves describes their position toward understanding the faith. Although medieval notions of faith had a strong element of humble obedience, theologians and canonists also acknowledge it had an intellectual, cognitive component. After all, if one was to humbly trust in God, one needed a basic understanding of the object of that trust. The church, as an institution, thus needed to give the layperson the basic foundation in which he or she should know about the triune God and the church. The theological emphasis of the 12th century developed into a practical emphasis from church authorities on knowledge and teaching the faith in the 13th century. The main mode of conveying this knowledge was through the Creed. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, was a notable watershed in this regard, but especially because of its 21st canon. This canon states, "All the faithful of both sexes shall, after they have reached the age of discretion, faithfully confess all their sins at least once a year to their own parish priest, and perform to the best of their ability the penance imposed." In the wake of this council, parochial priests were thrust into new roles as spiritual directors and catechists. One of the expectations for lay people approaching this annual confession was an examination of their knowledge of the faith by means of the Creed. Responding to this new position, the genre of pastoralia, or pastoral literature, developed in order to help train priests to catechize and instruct. Most of these pastoralia were organized around the Creed, providing a model method of instruction for priests. The success of this new emphasis on teaching the Creed is evident in literary, religious, and cultural references to the Creed from the 14th century onward. By the 14th century, knowing the Creed actually becomes a literary trope, a marker of one's knowledge of and commitment to religious life. For example, in the Canon Yeoman's Tale, one of the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer uses the Creed as an analogy of true belief. Believe this as true as your creed, I thank God, and rightly it may be said, that there was never man yet suffered evil, for gold or silver that he lent to me, nor did I ever intend falsehood in my heart. This and other literary references show that by the late 14th century, knowledge of the Creed was common in literature, in literate and probably illiterate society. The catechetical program embarked upon in the wake of Lateran IV of 1215 was remarkably successful, and the Creed was used as the object of proper Christian learning. Although beyond the scope of this paper, it is important to note that the Creed, along with the Our Father and Hail Mary, became the primary means of literacy instruction in the 15th and 16th centuries, primarily because of their elemental status in Christian history. Devotion. Keeping in mind the elements of devotional religion outlined above, occupying the space between liturgy and contemplation, Richard Kiekeffer provides three major categories of devotional practice: literary expression, artistic expression, and performance. There are examples of the Credo text being used in each of these categories, though I do not have the space in this paper to analyze examples of each category. It is possible that the increased devotional attention on the Creed grew out of the increased catechetical attention. In the earlier rule of Francis of Assisi from 1209, the Credo is used in this way as a placeholder for prayer. The lay brothers who know how to read the Psalter may have one. Those who do not know how to read, however, may not be permitted to have any book. Let the lay brothers say the Creed and 24 Our Fathers with the Glory for matins. For lauds, let them say 5. For prime, the Creed, etc. The Creed is so prominent in Francis's rule because it was a feature of the liturgical offices these recitations were replacing. But he further expects it as a memorized formula known by the illiterate brethren. Obviously, the literate brethren would not need these placeholders since they were allowed to own and read a psalter. One other significant use of the Creed as a devotional totem is as a magical formula. An early 14th century Franciscan preacher's handbook contains this advice on discerning witches from godly healers. But Raymundus, who was a 13th century Spanish Dominican canonist, says on this issue that if a man or woman gathers medicinal herbs or something of this kind and does so while reciting the Creed or the Lord's Prayer, or writes these on a piece of paper which he places on the sick person, so that by doing this he only honors God, the creator of all things, there is no reproach in this, as long as nothing else of a superstitious character gets mixed in with it. The Credo thus served many different purposes from a devotional viewpoint, and there are many more interesting examples of this devotional attitude towards the Creed. Moving on to liturgy. In order to recognize the liturgical changes to the Credo in the late medieval period, it must be set in relief against the liturgical changes of the rest of the ordinary. The earliest Curiales grouped the movements of the ordinary by movement, all the Kyries, all the Glorias, etc. The earliest surviving chants for the movements of the Mass ordinary preserve the tradition of highlighting the festivity of a day by means of troping, but these melodies from before the 13th century were not rubricated, and it is not always clear what feasts they are meant to go along with. The earliest manuscript with rubrics indicating the festal connection of the ordinary chants is probably Milan 116, which is a 12th century manuscript. Yet with the advent of the Dominican reforms of the liturgy beginning around the 1240s, books containing the chants of the ordinary collected them in mass cycles. Thus, instead of grouping all the Kyries followed by all the Glorias, the Dominican reforms led to groups of Kyrie Gloria Sanctus Agnus being identified as a particular mass. Leo Schrader locates a 13th century Kyriale, the Gradual of Santa Sabina in Rome, as containing some of the cycles of the modern Kyriale, specifically the modern Mass 4. Dom Dominic Cotta refers to graduals of the Dominicans as being the first to regularize the combinations and to accompany them with rubrics. Here are some pictures. It's hard to see, but you can see here there's a rubric in festis semi-duplicibus, so for semi-double feasts, and here we have a Kyrie and a Gloria, and on the next page there's a Sanctus. Same thing here. Here's a rubric. Here's one in Dominicis et Festis Simplicibus. So for Sundays and simple feasts, Kyrie, Gloria, Sanctus, Agnus. Because of their peregrinations, the Dominicans faced several different liturgical traditions within the houses and convents of the order. Though the Dominicans only received papal approval in 1216, by 1244, they had begun the process of liturgical unification, a process completed by 1256 by Humbert of Romans. The three exemplars of the Reformed Dominican liturgy are probably the earliest manuscripts which classify the various chants of the ordinary into Mass cycles. These Mass cycles were arranged by feast day, much as in the modern Vatican edition and Liber Usualis. We see in these Dominican manuscripts an extension of the celebration of the proper feast to the entire ordinary. But notably, the Creed was essentially omitted. We have Kyrie, Gloria, Sanctus, Agnus, because of the lack of musical choices for the Creed. Thus, the earliest instances of the newly composed Credos, starting in the early 14th century, extend the impulse of the Dominicans to associate ordinary chants with specific feast days. By the 15th century, various Credos were given festal associations and rubrics, such as Credo Apostolorum and Credos associated with the Feast of Mary. There are also attempts in the manuscripts to further this musical and liturgical association by organizing the Credos in a similar manner to the organization of the Mass ordinary chants. So, for example, Bologna Lit 12 contains a set of 4 plain chant Mass cycles, followed by 3 Credos, titled In Dominica, Cardinalium, and Apostolorum. So here's an example of the Kyrie. This is from the Kyrie Gloria Sanctus Agnus cycle, and this is the Mass for double minors, minoribus duplicibus, on the Lord's Day. Here Kyrie, we see the Gloria at the bottom of the page. And then a Credo titled In Dominica, so Feast of the Lord, or Sundays. Cardinalium, which is a title. The modern Vatican edition preserves this as Credo 4, without the mensuration. And Apostolorum. This Credo also has different titles, including Regis. Although this level of specificity of organization of Credo chants is not evident in the earliest sources of canto fratto Credos, the inclination to connect melodies with specific events in the liturgical calendar remains the same. So here are a few other, these are other manuscripts showing that the Credos were rubriced. So here's a Credo in Unum Deum, and this says in double feast and festis duplicibus. Here's another one, and there's a rubric written in Dominicis Diebus, so for the Lord's Day. This is again the Credo 4, or the Cardinalis melody. And this is I believe a Franciscan chant book, and this one also has in duplicibus majoribus for major doubles. And this is again the Credo 4 melody, Cardinalis. By judging how the status of the Credo grew in the late Middle Ages, we see that the jump in the number of Credo melodies is not a phenomenon out of thin air. Instead, the cultural and religious background helps to explain why so many church musicians composed Credos. Knowing the Credo straddled 3 important categories for Catholic Christians in this period. First, its contents defined doctrine, and knowing the Creed became such a commonplace that it was established as a trope of knowledge, like in the Chaucer example, or as an expected generic outline. Second, it was treated as an object of devotion. Recitation of and meditation on the Creed was an important unifier for Christians, integrating clergy and laity, literate and illiterate, landed gentry with their rich books of hours, and poor peasants in a small parish church. Knowing the Creed offered an opportunity for Christians to contemplate the birth, life, and death and resurrection of Jesus. as well as an understanding of the gift of the Holy Spirit and the establishment of the Catholic Church. Third, the Credo became an important feature of liturgy, especially in the wake of its official addition to the Roman Mass in the 11th century. As churchmen managed changes to the liturgy both from above, church authorities, and below, popular piety, the Creed settled into a prominent liturgical role, developing as a point of inflection comparable to the other movements of the ordinary. This confluence of catechesis, devotion, and liturgy around the Credo helps to explain why so many Credos were composed between 1300 and 1500, and even beyond, into the 1800s. Musicians were inspired to devote musical energies to a text that was important to know for a variety of reasons. In some cases, the melody may have aided in learning and memorization. In others, it may have served as an ornament for the liturgy, comparable to the high status of the Kyrie, Glorious, Sanctus, and Agnus chants, which were compiled to track with liturgical feast day celebrations. Time does not permit us to look at the musical structure of these new Credo compositions. I direct you to Marco Gozzi's analysis of the Credo Cardinalis and the Credo Regis melodies, the two most popular of these new Credo melodies, and his recordings, which are available on cantusfractus.org. Both of these melodies are essentially through composed, but exhibit some musical features which may preserve some sort of aide-memoire. Indeed, as Gozzi has detailed, these two Credos are frequently found pasted into older chant books as they grew in popularity. I'm also intrigued by the Credo melody that Dr. Hlavkova pointed to yesterday, which is actually regular in its musical phrasing and textual treatment. A few of these more regular Credo melodies seem to have been composed in the late 15th century. In general, however, though we still do not know the proximate cause for these new melodies, we do have enough evidence pointing to the high status of the Creed and a possible motive for composing new melodies for the text.